This is the second part installment of what we're calling Med Talks. And this week we have an exciting presentation. So we've got on the West Coast, Alora Martin and Heather Johnson from the East Coast. Both Heather and Alora have a similar role at Odyssey, and that's to be our directors of operation, which really is the pointy edge of the sword for us operationally, both from the how do we decide what we're going to do on an event? How do we get there? How do we execute? And then how do we get home? And they're charged with the primary responsibility of engaging with a dynamic clinical team that is based on the needs of the event. What is the event? What's the risk profile of the event? How do we decide who we're bringing? How do we decide what we're bringing? Equipment, supplies, material. And then how do we deliver all of that? And then they have the best part of their job, which is to report back on a budget. So they do that all within the confines and the constraints of fiscal responsibility to make sure that the events are delivered per the customer's expectations. So we've got a dynamic 35 minute presentation. By the time we roll, we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. And final point for me is that why we're here. We're here to lay the foundation, rekindle our love for event medicine. For some of us, it's a new activity or sport. For some of us, it's old hat, but it's really good opportunity after maybe a little bit of a hiatus to come back under some common language and understanding. And we're really excited that 23 is shaping up to be a phenomenal year. So I'm going to turn it over to Heather and to Alora. They're going to do a share screen, and then we will rip through some of their good slides and content.
All right, so intro to event ops. If we were to be professors and to bring you all into a classroom, this is what we would teach you. So here we go. So like Kevin said, we're going to discuss some takeaways. We'll discuss the event operations. What do we do from the operations piece? And then we have a little bit of discussion. All right, meet your ops team.
All right, I will take it away first. So my name is Alora. I know many of you, but it looks like there's a lot of people here from the East. So go Heather, that's awesome. I live in Chilliwack, BC. So it's about an hour-ish drive from Vancouver. Been with Odyssey for the past 7 years. I started off as a basic first aider or OFA 3, and I worked every core event I could get signed up for. Slowly started taking on some more of the planning things. And here we are today, Odyssey Lifer. My favorite type of event. I love them all, but the ones with more complexity or challenges, those are my favorites. Country music, have a soft spot there. And one fun fact, I have a wicked taxidermy collection. And just to state that I have no conflicts of interest, and we'll pass it over to Heather.
Thanks, Laura. Another fellow lifer. We are in it together. I live in Barrie, Ontario, grew up in Muskoka. I secretly wish I lived in BC though, but I don't think that Alora would make room for me. And I don't think I'd be allowed to leave to go to BC, but that's okay. I've been with Odyssey since I was 16. I started out on the water as a lifeguard, moved on to events with my EMR, and then just really loved the business side of events and moved over to the business side. My favorite type of events would definitely be music festivals, specifically EDM music festivals. And a fun fact about me is that I was born in Scotland, so not even from Canada. As Kevin was saying earlier, Kevin from Canada, I am Heather from Scotland. Okay, so we have a bit of a Slido, and you can vote what your favorite part of events are.
Probably Kevin from Canada.
Yeah. We've got being with people, more people, music, meeting others, teamwork, logistics, organized chaos. That is 100%. Laura and I should get that tattooed. Organized chaos. Someone just wrote Kevin. Oh, Kevin, you got a shout out. Learning from others. We obviously love to learn and teach. Crowds. It's crazy that the collective team said people. So that's probably our favorite part too. Oh, there's still some people typing. So I'll let you finish typing and then we'll move on. Circus meets the military. That was a good one.
Awesome. So this is what we're going to talk about today. So it's the 7 steps of event planning. So all of our events are built off of this workflow. So step 1 is our needs, our resources, and our risk assessment. It's where it all starts. So conversations with the client. It's talking about what their event looks like. and then taking all of those plans and determining if that matches the level of risk. We need some people. So step 2 is the people. So the crew and the attendees. We need to talk about all of it. 3 is our equipment and supplies, because with the people and no supplies, we can't really do our jobs. Number 4, infrastructure and logistics. We need a place, a tent, a building. We need porta potties, transportation. How is all of our stuff getting to event, around the event, on event? So UTVs, stretchers, things like that. And how do we get it all home? Communication is important. Pre-event to all of our crew, to our clients, on event, the radio comms, and then post-event, all of our reporting and our surveys that go out to the crew to help us better plan for next year. And then step 7, and the final step, is our administration. So that's everything pre-event and post-event that nobody else gets to see. It's all the fun stuff, reconciling budgets and creating those proposals and all the spreadsheets that I actually do love so much.
So to break it down even more, we have 3 different types of events. We have our core events, our venue, and then our major planned events. Our core events are our bread and butter. That's where you go to. They can be anywhere from 1 person, to single person deployment, to 8 people. It's your fun runs, your corporate events, your beer festivals, your triathlons. They're typically about less than 5,000 people. We have our venues. They are static. They don't change. You go in the same door every day. You come out the same door. You get to know the security guards, the bartenders, the maintenance staff. You walk in and they say, "Hey, Heather," which is also really nice. It's the same geographical location, and we have no temperature or weather issues because that is all controlled by us or the venue. And then we have our major planned events, which they are higher risk. We have our multidisciplinary team where we build up our festivals with field clinics that have their attendance of typically 5,000 to 50,000.
Awesome. So step number 1 is the needs, resources, and risk assessment.
Anyone who knows me knows that I'm happy to talk about risk. And that's how I entered into this industry. So I think when we look, we have this concept called risk match care. And I think the team alluded to that. And the idea is that not every event is built the same way, right? Even though they may be the same genre, they're geographically in a different place, or it's a slightly different audience. We've noticed differences between American content and American artists and American crowds. So location, date, historical information, what is the client requesting? What's the parking? What's the accommodation? What is the available infrastructure? Meaning, what do we need to bring in to satisfy or make a medical program that is commensurate or meets the needs of the environment? We have a team going out this weekend to a what we would call a mud run, but it's a snow run. And then they're going out to an event. This is a winter event in the outdoor context. So it involves us doing a different needs assessment because now we need to deeply understand and consider weather, right? And the weather is an opposite paradigm to what we do in the traditional event season, which is really looking at heat index. We're now looking at the cold index. So when we do those assessments have to be based on some intuition. Heather and Alora will talk about intuition a little bit in the sense that we just have an instinct of how this event is going to flow. It's going to be based on past incidences, what's happened in the past, and with the ultimate goal of us protecting the community, right? So our job as an event medical system is to protect the community from undue influx into the healthcare system. That sounds very simple in the context of a core event where we're at the Furry 5K. But when we're talking about a major event deployment, it actually adds another dimension because we could be introducing a large number of patients into the healthcare system, and the healthcare system is just not, it's fragile. It's not intended to, does not have the capacity to receive hundreds of patients over the course of a weekend in the event of a major planned event. And then last but not least is our stakeholders. Is working with and around the community that the event is being hosted in to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the community and the stakeholders. And the stakeholders could be all of our public safety partners, so police, fire, paramedic services. We could be looking at the local hospital system. We could be looking at the local transportation system in the case where we have road closures and the impact that road closures might have on people, accessing resources. So what are the impacts that this event may have on the community, with the goal of the event medical services to suppress or hold back the need for community resources, because we want our events to be self-sufficient.
Awesome. So then we move into our people, which we couldn't do any of this without all of you and everyone that makes all of the work happen on the ground. So I've put a little screenshot of a little deployment. It's a very small one, but this is typically one of our many spreadsheets that Alora and I work on. So we have our on-site time, our crew who's working, and we always make sure that we have our qualification. But where do we get all of that information? So we start with our recruitment. So that's hours and hours of interviews to onboard everyone, working with the HR team to ensure that everyone's in our system, or expressions of interest. So on our major planned events page, you can sign up and give us your certification. We take that, we make sure that you're credentialed, you are in fact a nurse, you are in fact who you say you are in fact a paramedic. We then create training and orientation, ensure that you have met all of our training and orientation, and your experience. What experience do you have? What experience can you bring to the table? When we're building deployments, we don't just think about your qualification. It's more than that. It's also who works well with who? What background do you have? Does Joe work really well at music events, but Sally works really well at sports events? So we take those things into consideration and make sure that we share our knowledge with one another. Our people is what gets the job done. And it takes time, so much time.
All right. So once we have the people, part of it is a lot of trips to Costco. I know, like every time in the summer when Kevin gives me a call, he's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm actually at Costco." And he's like, "Well, what do you need now?" All jokes aside, there's lots of snacks that need to be purchased. Crew care is so important. We'll make sure that everybody is happy, everybody has what they need to be successful in the event, including breaks and fruit roll-ups if that's what it takes. Pizza makes people happy. Merch, we love to do swag draw. We have the swag store online that I'm sure many people have taken a look at. Event specific perks. Sometimes clients are able to get us extra tickets or things like that for upcoming events for some of our volunteers as a perk. It's always nice.
All right, fun question. How many hours did Heather and Alora spend at Costco? 5 to 10 hours. I wish. Whoever voted on that, I wish. Costco, Monday night, never on the weekend. Guys, this is a super quick screenshot of one of our deployments. They look a little different from East and West, and they also look different based off of core, venue, or MPEs. This would be one of our MPEs. As you can see, we've got laid out of main med, where it's broken down to recess, acute, the roaming team. We also have to make sure that we account for how many roaming teams do we have. Dispatch, we've always got to make sure we take care of our dispatchers, and crew care, which we spoke about. So we've got everything laid out on the side. How much are we bringing? What are we not thinking about? This is where we take into consideration everything. We break it down to the very fine piece of, did we bring ice bags? We have ice, but did we bring bags for the ice? How are we transporting the ice? Do we have the coolers for all of the ice? How much ice do we have? How long are we there for? Is it going to be hot? How much do we need? Are we getting more? All of these little things come into play when we're thinking about equipment. The other things we think about are medications. How many drugs are we bringing to the event? How many people are we having? What kind of presentation, patient presentation, are we expecting to see? That plays in our drugs. And our clinical decision maker of the event is our key component in helping us decide our formulary for the event. Kevin, you have your hand up.
Heather and Alora and Carrie and Alan, folks that have done equipment and supply. What's a gremlin? What is an equipment gremlin? Batteries, vomit bags. A gremlin in context, of course, is something that commonly gets forgotten and overlooked, usually of minor consequence, but every event, to a point where I think Carrie, who was involved in equipment in the early days, had a list of things that were a common gremlin, right? That we didn't forget: batteries, pens, little silly things that make up. So the equipment and supply services that has to match the event. Go back to the risk match care. It has to match the expectations of the clinical staff working. But the gremlin is a thing. It's real.
Oh, it exists. And it always plays into something else. And then we're going to pass it over to Kevin again for logistics and infrastructure.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think it dovetails nicely in the equipment and logistics, the logistics matching the equipment in the process and flow. So first and foremost, we need to have a place to work, right? And we have to have a place to provide patient privacy, security of our equipment, and the ability to provide a welcoming environment for our clients. The type of equipment is based on the type of care in some instances. We have a basic model that goes to every event. We call it, in the equipment side, we would call it a PRK, so your primary response kits. And then we have a standard loadout. So if you're going to a 4-person for a 5K run, you're going to have a tent, you're going to have 2 chairs, you're going to have wastebasket, you're going to have tent weights, you're going to have an AED. There's some things that we consider in our world to be not negotiable, and the non-negotiables are going to be identification. Can the client or the patient find us? Hence why we use lime and orange, right? Can they find us? 2, do we have the basic life support to provide immediate care for, contextually the first 8 to 12 minutes of care? That's going to be the tools, the things that we need to provide personal protection and proper and appropriate care to our clients. We have a model of, with defibrillators, that there's no event that goes without electricity. And if you boil down and have worked in austere environments, Bob Harley on the call is a physician's assistant from the military. Bob's working in a lot of austere environments where you wish you had a lot of things, but you learn to deal with what you have. So we try to find a balance. It's impossible to get everything to every event that everybody wants. And the logistics and supply infrastructure piece needs to marry that, is to say, yes, it would be nice, but we also have a modality of how it's getting there. So just recently, Alan Soper sent a load of equipment into Edmonton, and there's a ship. We have a standard crate that goes to Edmonton. You just can't have everything that you would want based on the space available to get it there. So how are we getting it to event, and how are we getting it home? If you've ever done anything in third-party logistics, transportation and logistics, you know how hard that is. What is our on-site infrastructure? Can we rely on anything from the client? Does the client have any supplies that we're able to dovetail with ours? Tables and chairs are a really good example. When you set up a medical space, you never have enough tables and chairs. I don't know what it is. I think we eat them, but there's never enough chairs. There's never enough tables. There waste baskets, garbage cans, those sorts of things. How do we deal with that? And then the offside of logistics and infrastructure is people don't understand. They don't think about is what do we do with the blood and vomit? So the blood and the puke post event. You think I'm laughing, you think I'm joking, right? When you're at an event and you're in a convention hall and you have clients who have produced a certain amount of bodily substances, how do you deal with that? What's the appropriate methodology for dealing with large volumes of waste? Is it truly biohazardous waste and contaminated, or sharps? Or is this just bodily fluids that can be dealt with through the local sanitation processes? The logistics and infrastructure team needs to consider that and understand how to deal with that. And those are all things that have slapped us in the forehead over the years, where it's like, oh, we haven't encountered this large volume of vomit. What do we do with it, and how do we take care of it, and how do we respect the environment that we're working in, and the physical environment itself?
Then we move over to transportation. So how do we get to event? How do we transport on an event? And how do we get home from the event? So as we all know, GTA and Vancouver parking is scarce. If that even might be an overstatement. We know that it's very, very difficult to find any form of parking. So we always have to communicate with the clients to make sure that there is parking for not only the staff and the team, but also our trailers. When we bring all this equipment, we need to have a place to park it all so that it's not driven back to the warehouse and then brought back down. So we have to take all of that into consideration on how are we getting there? Is there alternate means that we could provide? Subway lines, bus lines, Uber, transportation to the event. How do we transport on event? That's where we think about the UTVs. So do we have supine capable UTVs? Are they going to be used for logistics? Are we using wheelchairs? Is wheelchairs at the end of a marathon? We love wheelchairs at the end of a marathon. We all know that everyone finishes a marathon and they just stop, and then all of a sudden they can't walk anymore. So the wheelchairs are perfect. We have these things called Rex, love a Rex. They're a wheelchair mixed with a stretcher, had a baby, and we can carry people on a little bit more of a supine modality. So we take those into consideration. Or are we heel toe expressing it, and what's the equipment that they're using? We also have to take into consideration all of the pieces associated with that. How much gas are we bringing? Did we bring bikes? Did we bring helmets for the bikes? What if we get a flat tire with the bike? Do we have the bike pump? All those little things that we forget, the gremlins that Kevin was saying earlier. And then how do we get home from event? Everyone's exhausted. We just worked a multi-day festival, or we've been up since 4 a.m. at a marathon, and now we have to pack everything back up. So what are we doing to pack it all up in a timely and efficient way, and then putting it back in the most efficient way to get it back home?
All right, communication. So this is where all of our spreadsheets, our forms, our surveys all kind of come into play. So we start with the expression of interest. So usually it's a form, it's posted to our website, it's sent out through our mailing list. All your friends will share it, hopefully. Sometimes people just send random emails and they're like, I heard you're working this event. How do I get involved? I want to be added to your mailing list. From there, we add them all into a spreadsheet where everyone gets communicated with, probably far too much for some people. Some people it's not enough information, but that's where we're here to answer everyone's questions pre-event. We want to make sure that you have all the details, or as much detail as we have. Some events, it's a challenge to get the information until we actually arrive on site. So the last event I worked, for example, we didn't have information until the night before I showed up. We had to figure out what the parking looked like. We had to figure out what the entrance looked like, what the access looks like. So as soon as we have the information, it's always shared out, but sometimes there is a little bit of a delay. Shift confirmations and the crew email, there's going to be a lot of them. And then we just ask that everybody confirms their shifts pre-event so that we know you're coming, so that we can allocate t-shirts and food and credentials and have everything for everyone once they arrive.
Thanks, Laura. And then we have our communication on event. So we've got our dispatch teams, our radios, typically how we communicate. We have different call types that are utilized through events. So we've got, you dispatched it, a dispatcher told you to move from point A to point B. You were flagged down while you were walking or driving along. You rolled upon one. Production and VIP came and asked you for one, or we have our Mental Health Act calls. The biggest thing that we want to make sure that we have, that we remember for communication on event, is that our dispatchers are our lifeline. They are what they get us everything. They communicate from one side of the festival to the other side of the festival. So they are how we get everything around. And so we want to make sure that we are always talking clearly and concisely when we're speaking with them. I will not go into dispatch on event any further and communication further, as because there's a med talk later in the year about that one.
Yeah, and communication on event, not always perfect, as we have also learned in some markets. Some of the buildings don't allow for radio comms, and then we have to use our backup, figuring out on the fly when doors open that the radio system is not sufficient and you go to WhatsApp or text. It happens almost every single time. And post-event, so the administration. So, well, I guess pre-event. Every event has an emergency action plan to set it out. It'll give all the event-specific protocols, your hospital locations, all of our key contacts, stakeholder information, and that's all circulated to everybody that needs it pre-event. Our event after action reports are completed for every event, big or small. It definitely helps us better understand the needs of each specific event and helps us with our planning for the following years. When we're ready to write these proposals, we get to look back and see what went well and what we needed to do a little differently for the following year. We can also use this for comparables. So if we get an ask to support an event that is similar, maybe in a different location or maybe the same location, but a different genre, something like that, we can use our after action reports as a comparable, and it's a good place to start rather than just starting from scratch. Financial wrap up, we do a lot of ops budgets, lots of spreadsheets. I love them. I don't think Heather loves them as much, but lots of budgets, patient care reports. Everything ends up back at the warehouse. On event, we need to make sure that all of those PCRs are completed properly, has patient names, has the right event name, ends up in the envelope and flagged if there's, any transport or things like that. And the last part of admin is the staff feedback or crew feedback. So most of the major planned events have a survey attached to them at the very end. So we create a survey and we ask for everyone's feedback from the crew. And usually it's very honest and we do appreciate that. And I read every single comment that comes through so we can better plan for the following years. And sometimes the comments are things like, we wanted more fresh fruit rather than pizza, but we do take it into consideration, that's for sure.
Oh, I think it's interesting to look at trends because I think it's a little bit of looking into a crystal ball. I gave Heather some notes and Laura some notes on this, and they're like, "Hey, let's have you talk about these." So, music. I think what we're seeing is there's a lack of crowd mentality and a crowd safety system that's developed over maybe being off of crowds for 2 years. I wonder why? So there may be a little bit of misunderstanding of how to behave in a crowd or a crowd mentality. How do you care for yourself? Certainly, we're seeing higher levels of various intoxications. And in some cases, it's not just the traditional drugs and alcohol. Sometimes it's a mix thereof that's driving some of the context inside of the music environment. And we're seeing a lot of attraction to smaller venues, oddly enough, instead of the larger venues. Sport always remains high profile. When we're on an Olympic drive, we tend to see a higher participation in some of the civilian sports. So it's nice to see that some of the events are richer and fuller because people were leading into a larger international sporting stage. So there seems to be some additional desire to participate in sports. So cross country skiing and cycling, when we're in an Olympic year, there seems to be a drive towards more participation at that. And people are still staying local. So we're seeing an increased number in that. High risk sport seems to be flat. I don't see the X Games, the Red Bull Foot Togs, those sorts of things. I don't think there is a large number of people attending those events. They're still very much in the specialty and niche market. Everyone's fighting for airtime. So how do you make your event different? How do you make your event more attractive? How do you attract sponsors? Sponsorship dollars for events is certainly on the decline, meaning there's less dollars out there on behalf of corporations to put their money towards sponsorship. They're more inclined to put it towards different marketing avenues. Low risk sports, walks, our fundraisers, they continue to be very popular at the local level. The swing in the industry is trying to do smaller footprint events, trying costs. You've no doubt heard about this pressure in the supply chain. The supply industry, that's the event industry, has succumbed to that as well. We're talking about a twofold increase in cost in some situations. So a Porta John used to cost you $125 per weekend. Might be costing you $250 for the same time period. So how do we mitigate those costs? And the ticket prices aren't going up respectfully that same distance. From the endurance supply side of things, we're seeing a decline in long distance events. So less preparation for participants. Doing a marathon takes pre-work, training, 6 months of lead in to participate in one, fairly and safely. Whereas you could show up at the Furry 5K and just go do that on a Saturday on a whim. Show up and do what they call day of registration and just decide to participate, because really there's no prep involved. And then we're seeing an increase of expectation of mental health supports on events. We're seeing an increased call for people that are they're having mental health scenarios that require us to have more mental health staff prepared and ready to respond to those types. And then an increase in what we call harm reduction. So the services that we can provide to reduce harm for the participants when they're on site, particularly if they're engaging in any in forms of intoxicants. So what can we do to make that a safe or as safe as we can environment?
So 2022 notables, it was definitely a season to remember. We were all coming out of COVID. Surprisingly, we had 5 VSAs in Ontario and comparably 0 in BC. So when you look at trends, that was a little interesting for us. It was the COVID rebound. Everyone was coming out of COVID. People were coming back to events. It was the place for all practitioners to come and escape their daily work where they were masked all the time, seeing COVID patients all day, every day, but you could come to events and it wasn't COVID patients all day, every day. So we definitely saw that. And we had an average of about 100 patients transported from event, which equals a 1.6 transport rate, which is absolutely tremendous. So excellent work on our team. Some planning notables that we always take into consideration, some things that we noticed last year, was the event complexity. We have one event that we cover where it's a moat. So in order for us to move around it, it's like a castle. The event is a castle and we have to travel around the moat in order to get people from point A to our medical tent. So we always have to take that into consideration. I'll let Alora speak to the rest because Alberta EDM is all her.
Yeah, some of the other complexities, we had a lot of flooding out in BC this past year that changed the landscape of some of the venues that we were working at. So for some of the multi-day festivals, that was definitely a challenge. Alberta EDM is on the list because there are some city regulations that came into effect for EDM events that determine the number and type of providers that a medical team has to have on site for each event. And they actually come around and they'll check to make sure you have 5 nurses and 5 paramedics and 2 doctors or whatever the scope is. So that's added in an added layer. Multi-day festivals, always fun, especially if they're camping. So we have 24/7 coverage for sometimes 5 or 6 days. Large team, people get tired. If it's 30+ degrees, adds to an extra layer. And then triathlons. So that's on there just because that is like, starts super early and super late. But if you've ever been at the finish line at midnight, it's something to see, that's for sure. The very last person that crosses, it makes it all worth it.
Absolutely. And we also have the water aspect of triathlons. I will not lie, triathlons are one of my favorite, but it's kind of scary when everyone's out on the water. And then there's a bike left, but it just turns out that person went home and decided they didn't want to ride and they didn't want to tell anyone. So that's definitely a complexity, is the water safety. Okay, so a couple discussions. What is the most interesting part of preparing for an event, Alora?
Is that they're all so different.
Yeah.
Year after year, we can say that we're just gonna rinse and repeat the same event because we've already done it, 3-4 years in a row, but they are never the same. There is always going to be something challenging, something different that makes them unique.
And we think that we can rinse and repeat, and we'll just I'm going to use an equipment gremlin, and we'll just bring the same deployment list, and then we'll forget something important. Or we'll forget those little things, like we'll forget the wheelchairs and we've got to run back and get the wheelchairs. So it's not always a rinse and repeat. I would say the most interesting part is seeing it all come together. We have dashboards on dashboards and spreadsheets on spreadsheets, and we communicate with everyone all the time. We communicate with the client, we communicate with the crew, but then when we're actually on the event and we get to see it all come together and we get to see all of you and all of the crew there doing what they love, I think that's the most interesting part, is seeing it, all of the pieces of the puzzle come together and everyone enjoying what they're doing. Is really cool. What genre event have you seen that changed the most?
The provinces as a for this instead, rather than genre, because I got the opportunity to travel to Ontario for some EDM events, and I brought the furry ears and glitter, and I got out of the car and she was like, "What are you wearing? We don't wear that here." But out in Vancouver, like, that's just the vibe. You fit right in, you wear the glitter, you wear the furry ears, and you're more approachable. And Heather was like, "No, that's not what we do here." So it was definitely interesting to see the differences across all the provinces.
And then I went out there and I glittered up with furry ears. So I can see Carrie laughing. We'll send you pictures, Carrie. That's funny. You threw me for a loop there. Genre of event that I've seen change the most. I think we've seen a big change in music, but I really think we've seen a big change in triathlons. Like Kevin said, when it's an Olympic year, there's a lot of people that are striving and trying to do their best, whether they're trying to qualify for something or because the Olympics are on, it's, I've got to get in shape now. So then they start to get more involved. I think that I've seen a decline in triathletes, but I've also seen more triathletes excel. So our VIPs and our athletes, our elites, they have definitely excelled a lot in their work and their races.
I think we can talk about the patients. I think we can talk about the presentation of the people that are attending events and their expectations. I think COVID made people more aware of safety, right? As safety pros, when you go into a washroom and you can't find the hand sanitizer, you're like, geez, what's wrong with these people? Like, can't they get the hand sanitizer right? I think that's made the general public and the attendee more aware. They're more aware of safety. They're more aware of infectious disease. I think the caution is still present. Although I think the masking and some of the other proactive stuff that's being done to safeguard people, it's just changed. It's just changed people's perspective. I think Bob put in something that says changed after legalization, and I think that refers to the legalization of marijuana. Or in BC, right? Certain amount of drugs have been legalized to carry under a certain weight or volume. When you talk to the Porta-John guys, the people that pump septics, they're like, oh, since the legalization of marijuana, we pump less septic. And you're like, what? At events, what's the correlation? And they're like, oh, people used to go to the beer garden, they'd have 7 beers. Now they smoke a joint and then go and have 2 beers. So they actually can measure against pre-legalization the amount of septic volume that they were moving versus the post-legalization septic volume is less. So there's little micro trends inside of the industry. We've become more aware of crowd safety. People are more aware. Every incident that happens where there's crowd safety issues, people become more aware of that. I don't know about you folks, but sometimes it is hard to turn off the safety brain. You're traveling with your family at Walt Disney and you're like, okay, what happens if something bad happens right now? Where am I going? What am I doing? How am I reacting? Right? You're sitting on a plane. You're like, okay, what happens if they call for a medical professional on the plane? Right? What do I do? How do I react? What can I be expected of me? So I think there's just more awareness, both on the crowd side and also on the patient side. Patients are expecting a certain level of service that thankfully the event medicine world or the industry has set a high watermark of the services that are going to be rendered on site.
And I think we're seeing a lot more anxiety calls. You alluded to that earlier. People are not used to crowds. I found even when I was back at my first event, a crowd of 35,000, 50,000, it's overwhelming. We were in isolation for so long, and then you come out and you're exposed to all of these people at once. And we saw a very large increase in anxiety calls this year, and a lot of it was induced by the crowd. So I thought that was very interesting.
I mean, I think as we dovetail the closure of the presentation, I think it goes without saying that you both did a wonderful job of explaining the roots of some of the thinking. And as the series graduates, we're going to start to graduate into different, more medical topics. But we really wanted to send the first 3 of these as really foundational topics for folks that have maybe been involved with Odyssey or may not have been. This is not solely, this has been extended to a much wider community, and we want to make sure that folks feel that they've got a good solid foundation in what mass gathering medicine is. And now what we've gone through is how do we get to and how do we execute the events based on the explanations that both Heather and Alora provided us today. So a big congratulations to both of you for putting together this presentation. I bet you if you ask them both, hey, do you want to do that again? They might have, yesterday they would have said not sure. Today they might say, yes, I would. But I think it's a valuable contribution to our ecosystem that people understand what happens in the background. And I think anyone who's worked in a leadership role understands that it's like an iceberg, right? People only see the tip of that. They see just the tip of the iceberg versus the base of the iceberg, all of the work that goes in and all the background work. I think there's sometimes an assumption of simplicity. And really it is sometimes down to the wire. Alora, I'll echo your sentiment of being on site recently with a client where the client was unavailable the day before the event, literally not around, not available. And you're like, I need answers that only can ever be answered on the day at the time, right? Because you're making micro decisions, you're making adjustments to space. Ended up having our medical tent, and our medical tent was flanked by the women's washroom and the men's washroom. Like, thankfully they were flush toilets. So you're like, it looks like there's 2 major lineups of the medical tent, when in reality they're not. They're just people waiting to go to the washrooms. I know. The girls' lineup was 5 times longer than the guys' lineup. I get that, right? So there's an imbalance, but there's 2 big lineups. So it's adding a little bit of commotion. That couldn't have been taken care of in pre-planning, just with the way that these organizers were staged and set up. So it was a micro decision that we've been able to capture. in the rear view mirror. So now we know at that site, at that venue, which we hadn't worked before, we have to be more specific about the placement, because we think we want close to washrooms, but we want to be close to a washroom, not close to the washrooms. And there's a big difference. And then from a logistical standpoint, going into this same venue had very strong restrictions on when your equipment could arrive, and your supplies could arrive. They have to arrive within a specific window. And if it didn't, the material got rejected. So there's a little bit of pins and needles on Laura and Alan's part, holding their breath to make sure that the supplies and the equipment land on time, land with a window. And if you've ever shipped material across continent, it doesn't always arrive on the date, time, and place. So we've had to rebuild some of our systems to understand how to move that equipment in a more efficient way. So lots of little things have changed. I could reminisce all day. Thank you all for coming. Again, extend my gratitude to both Heather and to Laura for their submissions.
I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today, or and those of you that are going to watch later. Thank you.
Folks, have a great day. Travel safe.